What if I told you that the most powerful banking empire in the world, a family that controlled kings and popes, that financed wars and built cathedrals, could vanish almost overnight? Imagine walking through the grand halls of Florence, where gold flowed like water, where a single signature could topple kingdoms. Now imagine those same halls empty, the vaults bare, the name that once commanded respect now whispered with pity. This is not fiction. This is the true story of the Medici Bank, and how an empire built over generations crumbled into dust within decades. In the year 1397, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici opened a small bank in Florence, Italy. Florence was already a city of merchants and traders, but Giovanni had vision. He did not just want to be another banker counting coins. He wanted to build something that would last forever. Giovanni was a quiet man, careful with his words and even more careful with his money. He understood something that others did not. Money was not just gold and silver. Money was power. Money was influence. Money could buy armies, build churches, and make popes. Giovanni started small, offering loans to local merchants and wool traders. But his real breakthrough came when he began lending money to the Catholic Church. The Church was the wealthiest institution in Europe, and it needed banks to move its vast fortunes across the continent. Giovanni won the contract to manage papal finances, and suddenly, the Medici name meant something. The profits poured in, and Giovanni expanded his operations, opening branches in Rome, Venice, and Geneva. When Giovanni died in 1429, he left his sons Cosimo and Lorenzo a thriving business and a simple piece of advice: stay humble, stay quiet, and never let power go to your head. Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's eldest son, took control of the bank and transformed it into something his father could never have imagined. Cosimo was brilliant, cunning, and patient. He understood that real power did not come from wearing a crown but from controlling those who did. Under Cosimo's leadership, the Medici Bank became the largest and most respected financial institution in Europe. Branches opened in London, Bruges, Lyon, and Avignon. The bank financed trade routes, funded merchants, and loaned enormous sums to kings and nobles across the continent. Cosimo personally managed relationships with the most powerful families in Europe. He loaned money to the King of England, the Duke of Milan, and the Pope himself. But Cosimo was not just a banker. He was a statesman. He used his wealth to control Florence's government from behind the scenes, never taking a title, never wearing a crown, but always holding the strings. The people loved him because he spent lavishly on public works, building libraries, churches, and hospitals. Artists and scholars flocked to Florence under his patronage. Cosimo commissioned works from the greatest minds of the Renaissance. He was called Cosimo the Elder, and when he died in 1464, he was given a title no commoner had ever received, Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. Cosimo's son Piero took over the bank, but he was not the man his father was. Piero was sickly and weak, suffering from gout that left him bedridden for months at a time. The bank's managers, who had been kept in line by Cosimo's iron will, began to sense weakness. Piero tried to be cautious. He called in loans and tightened credit, trying to stabilize the bank's finances. But this created enemies. Merchants who had borrowed heavily suddenly found themselves forced to pay back debts they could not afford. Several major clients defaulted, and branches in London and Bruges began reporting losses. Piero's caution came too late. The damage was already done. The bank had grown too large, too complex, and too dependent on risky loans to powerful but unreliable clients. When Piero died in 1469, just 5 years after taking control, the bank was already showing cracks. He left everything to his son Lorenzo, a young man of just 20 years old, brilliant and charismatic but completely unprepared for the storm that was coming. Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was a poet, a philosopher, and a patron of the arts. He was friends with Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli. He turned Florence into the cultural center of the world, where art and ideas flourish like nowhere else on earth. But Lorenzo was not a banker. He found the details of accounting and finance boring. He trusted his managers to handle the business while he focused on politics and culture. This was his first mistake. The managers, sensing that Lorenzo was distracted, began taking bigger risks. They made loans without proper collateral. They invested in ventures that had little chance of success. The branch in Bruges made a massive loan to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who was fighting expensive wars. When Charles died in battle in 1477, the loan died with him. The Medici Bank lost over 50,000 florins, a staggering sum that would be worth millions today. The London branch made similar mistakes, lending huge amounts to King Edward IV of England for his wars. When Edward could not pay, the branch collapsed entirely, and the Medici lost everything. But the real catastrophe came in 1478, during what history calls the Pazzi Conspiracy. The Pazzi family, rivals of the Medici and bankers themselves, grew jealous of the Medici's power. They wanted to destroy the Medici family and take control of Florence for themselves. With the secret support of Pope Sixtus IV, who had his own grievances against Lorenzo, the Pazzi plotted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in Florence Cathedral. On April 26, 1478, as the priests raised the communion host, the assassins struck. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times and died on the cathedral floor, his blood staining the marble. Lorenzo barely escaped, wounded but alive. The people of Florence, loyal to the Medici, rose up in fury. They dragged the Pazzi conspirators through the streets and hanged them from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. But the conspiracy had consequences. Pope Sixtus excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, meaning no church services could be held. Then he declared war, sending an army to invade Florentine territory. Lorenzo had to spend the bank's money to defend the city, draining the reserves. The war with the Pope lasted 2 years and cost the Medici Bank dearly. Lorenzo was forced to use the bank's money as if it were his own personal treasury. He paid for soldiers, fortifications, and bribes. He negotiated peace by traveling personally to Naples to meet with the king, a dangerous gamble that could have cost him his life. He succeeded, and the war ended, but the bank never recovered. The branches across Europe were failing one by one. The Geneva branch closed in 1479. The London branch was already gone. The Bruges branch, once the most profitable in the network, shut down in 1480. The Lyon branch followed in 1485. Each closure meant massive losses, debts that could never be collected, investments that turned to dust. Lorenzo tried to keep up appearances, continuing to spend on art and festivals, but inside the palace, the accountants were panicking. The books showed disaster. The Medici Bank was dying, and there was nothing Lorenzo could do to stop it. By 1490, only the branches in Florence and Rome remained, and even those were struggling. Lorenzo's health was failing too. He suffered from terrible arthritis and stomach pains. He knew the end was near, both for himself and for the bank his grandfather had built. Lorenzo died on April 8, 1492, at the age of 43. He left behind a Florence transformed into a Renaissance jewel, but a bank in ruins. His son Piero too took over, but he was incompetent and arrogant. Within 2 years, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, and Piero surrendered Florence without a fight. The people exiled the Medici family in disgrace. The bank, already on life support, finally collapsed completely. The branches closed, the debts went unpaid, and the Medici fortune, once estimated at over 200,000 florins, evaporated. Creditors fought over the scraps, but there was almost nothing left. The building that had housed the main Florence branch was sold to pay debts. The ledgers were packed away, silent witnesses to the greatest banking failure Europe had ever seen. What happened to all that wealth? Where did the billions go? The answer is simpler and sadder than any conspiracy theory. The money was spent. It was spent on wars, on art, on palaces and churches, on bad loans that were never repaid, on bribes and gifts and the endless cost of maintaining power. The Medici had confused their personal ambition with the bank's business. They treated the bank's vaults as their own piggy bank, taking out funds whenever they needed to finance a political scheme or commission another sculpture. Giovanni di Bicci had warned his sons to stay humble, but his descendants forgot that lesson. They believed they were untouchable, that their name alone was enough to guarantee success. They stopped paying attention to the details, the careful accounting and risk management that had made the bank great in the first place. The managers they trusted betrayed that trust, making risky loans and covering up losses. When the bills came due, there was nothing left to pay them with. The Medici family would return to Florence years later, and they would even produce popes and queens, but they would never rebuild the bank. The age of the Medici Bank was over. Other families, like the Fuggers of Germany, would rise to take their place, learning from the Medici's mistakes. The Medici Bank's collapse taught the world a hard lesson about the dangers of mixing business with politics, about the risks of unchecked ambition, about what happens when you build an empire on debt and forget that every loan must someday be repaid. The ledgers of the Medici Bank are still preserved in the archives of Florence, thousands of pages of records documenting every transaction, every loan, every payment. Historians have studied them for centuries, piecing together the story of how the greatest banking empire in history fell apart. Those pages tell a story of human ambition, of genius and folly, of wealth that seemed infinite until suddenly it was gone. Standing in Florence today, you can still see the legacy of the Medici everywhere. The Duomo's dome, the Uffizi Gallery, the statues in every piazza, the paintings in every church. The Medici turned Florence into a work of art, a city that still draws millions of visitors who walk the same streets where Giovanni di Bicci once counted coins and Cosimo the Elder once held court. But you will not find the Medici Bank. No bronze plaque marks the building where it stood. The bank is gone, erased by time and failure, remembered now only in history books and dusty ledgers. The fortune vanished, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, like water leaking from a cracked vessel, until one day the vessel was empty. This is the truth that history teaches us again and again. No empire lasts forever. No fortune is truly safe. Power is fleeting, and pride comes before the fall. The Medici thought they had built something eternal, but they built it on sand. The moral of this story is not that ambition is wrong or that wealth is evil. The moral is about balance and wisdom. Giovanni di Bicci built the bank on careful management and humble service. Cosimo expanded it with brilliant strategy and attention to detail. But their descendants forgot the fundamentals. They stopped being bankers and started being princes. They forgot that money is not magic, that wealth must be earned and protected, that power without responsibility leads to ruin. Every empire, every business, every fortune faces a choice. Will you remember where you came from, or will you believe your own legend? The Medici chose the legend, and the legend destroyed them. As you go about your own life, building whatever empire you dream of, remember the empty halls of the Medici Bank. Remember that success is not permanent and that the higher you climb, the farther you have to fall. Stay humble. Pay attention to the details. Never believe you are too big to fail. Because as the Medici learned in the hardest way possible, the fortune that took generations to build can vanish in the blink of an eye.